introduction, I want to tell you two aspects of my lifestyle that are not included generally in my CV. The first is that I'm not an early morning person. I do rise early, but it takes me a long time each morning from waking up until I'm fit to encounter anybody. And the second is that I have an addiction. I have an addiction to television news bulletins, and I'm well equipped with satellite communication to receive bulletins from numerous European, American channels, and indeed from farther afield. So it means that I spend part of the early hours of each morning watching television news bulletins. Now perhaps I should dedicate that time to prayer, but attention to the news bulletins is sometimes too much for me. I make this public confession because I want to talk a little bit about the coverage in the international media of the recent scandal about Irish pork. It might come as a surprise to many of you that this item was the second item on the Italian news bulletins for a full week, and that an entire talk show on Italian television was dedicated lock, stock and barrel to dioxin. And each morning an Italian agricultural minister, senior or junior, or some senior official would reassure viewers that the measures being taken in Ireland were purely precautionary. There was no great danger, the matters were in hand. And curiously, by the third morning, the discussion had moved surprisingly away from pork to the possibility that perhaps Irish beef could also be a problem. And we were told that Irish beef accounts for about 8% of the beef market in Italy. The message was still reassuring. There was no need to worry. Irish beef was fundamentally, the danger from Irish beef was fundamentally minimal. But then came punchline. The risk from Irish beef is minimal. But if you do want to be absolutely safe, then eat Italian beef. Now, when I told people in Dublin about that punchline, the first comment was usually about, oh, this is a nasty Italian campaign to denigrate Irish meat products and to turn consumers definitively in favour of Italian meat. My reaction was different. 8% of the Italian market means that sales of Irish beef to Italy are larger than sales of Irish beef in Ireland. And this is a success story of Irish beef, which despite the protectionism of many in the farming community, is to a large part thanks to our membership of the European Union. There are many things to criticise the European Union and its member states about, but it would be very hard to underplay the positive effect that it's had on Ireland and the positive potential that is still there to exploit. That said, I have to register the fact that there are some commentators who say that I am among the most pro-European of the Irish bishops, and therefore any comments I make should be taken with great caution. I'm not sure that's actually correct. I speak of the successes of the European Union, but I have many caveats when I speak of the successes of the European Union. Take, for example, the affirmation made also by Pope Benedict that the EU has been responsible for generations of peace in Europe. Yes, I agree. The European nationalism had indeed, in the 20th century, given rise to two of the most disastrous wars in human history. And I still shudder at the horrors of the fighting in the trenches in the First World War, and the stories of children falsifying their age to be enrolled, wanting to go to war, and thinking going to war was something good. Europe, with the exception of the Balkans, has not seen an ongoing war now for over 60 years. And this is an enormous achievement. We thank God for it, but we cannot attribute that entirely to the European Union. NATO was also built on the principle of integration. It aimed at keeping the military powers of Europe integrated. That also meant not allowing any one of them to remilitarize to the detriment of others. And after the fall of the communist states, the desire of Central and Eastern European countries to integrate into a new Europe meant joining NATO just as much as joining the European Union. And they knew that at a perilous moment for their security, that security would only be defended through the participation in an alliance which included the United States. The realization of how their security was linked to a North Atlantic alliance might also explain to some degree the greater willingness of Central and European countries to support the United States on other occasions. And then the culture of human rights, which is a fundamental pillar of EU policy. But that culture owes as much, if not even more, to the Council of Europe than to the EU. And indeed, there is a sense in which the Cold War itself and the doctrines of containment and deterrence also contributed, if not to peace, at least to the absence of war. So the European Union has contributed to years of peace, but not always on its own. Others will say that my positions on Europe have led me to downplay the fact that it is precisely the style of prosperity created within the European Union that has brought about a climate of materialism and a rejection of Christian values. Now, my first response to anybody who says that to me is that taking huge sectors of the European population out of poverty and precariousness is an achievement about any Christian can only rejoice. And if such poverty or such prosperity has been accompanied by a change in belief patterns within Europe, this may be due to lack of dynamism on the part of the churches in a cultural climate that is changing just as much as to any European Union. It's also important that our estimation of where religious values are going within the current European Union should be determined by proper research rather than by ideologies of any side. The European Values Study urges a certain caution in presuming that we have, and I quote, gone all secularist. The Values Atlas sums it up. It says, one thing is certain, the old continent is not as secularized as it seems. And I can say that the level of religious practice in some highly secularized European countries is higher than the instances of of practice in my diocese. And the same value study points out that Europeans do not find marriage and faithfulness as outdated institutions or values. So we need to look at the facts and to interpret the facts. Certainly in the debates around the second referendum on the Lisbon Treaty, certain moral and ethical questions will emerge once again as significant in the formation of the judgment of the Irish electorate. The Irish government is hopeful that a number of binding protocols can be negotiated which will guarantee respect for some specific ethical values as enshrined in the Irish Constitution. Will this be possible? There are those who say that such protocols are hardly worth the paper they are written on. And certainly this is one of the questions on which the electorate will have to form an opinion. One would be foolish to think that such protocols might not be challenged, and challenged on the basis of other aspects of European law, especially coming from the area of non-discrimination and equality of norms, and equality norms. In the message that the Irish bishops published before the first referendum on the Lisbon Treaty, it was noted that in a climate of legal positivism, attempts may well be made to use traditional language, for example about human dignity, in a way that is different to the traditional sense. Court decisions on a national and an EU level tend to interpret language today, and administrative decisions may well interpret norms in a particular way. About words changing meaning, I was struck in the introduction in saying that some people here had crossed my path. Now, that I think was meant to say that we had a friendly engagement with one another in encounters across the years. If that had been said about my predecessor, Archbishop McQuaid, saying he had crossed my path, it probably would have been interpreted in a slightly different way. So we have this challenge of that the use of language changes, and it would be foolish to ignore that possibility. But I believe there's only one way to overcome that danger, and that is for public representatives to engage actively, to engage with a broad coalition of other like-minded governments, organisations, European public opinion, to avoid such innovative interpretations, and also to keep an eye on what would be called competence creep by some European institutions with regard to the autonomy of national governments. But legal positivism and constitutional innovation are not the unique possession of European law. You should always remember that in Ireland, abortion became legal in certain circumstances, not through political pressure from Brussels, but through the interpretation of the Irish Constitution by an Irish court. Within European political culture, there are certain tendencies towards a more secularist, positivistic, and relativist philosophy. But these tendencies would not vanish by ignoring them or by simply criticising them from the margins from outside. What is needed, as I've said on other occasions, is critical engagement from within. Christians in Europe should assert their commitment to Europe and unashamedly bring their contribution within the democratic opportunities that are available. And a truly pluralist Europe on its part should not feel threatened by the Christian message, which is a message about a God who loves, a message capable of enlightening and enriching the European project. I personally would have preferred to see a reference in the Lisbon Treaty to the Christian heritage of Europe. I believe, to use the words of Paul-Henri Spaak, an atheist, when he said, "For many of its founders, the Christian imprint on the European factor has been an indisputable fact." But such a reference did not appear. And I feel that in the current situation, the best way to counteract those who would play down the significance of the Christian contribution to Europe in history is not through lamenting or crying over the absence of such a reference, but by witnessing to the significance for today's Europe of those perennial values which have always been at the root of the Christian contribution. And the Lisbon Treaty would offer new possibilities of channeling this contribution through forms of structured dialogue between the Commission and religious and philosophical bodies. European Christians need a European strategy, and Irish Christians need a European strategy. They need to be engaged in the debates, challenging any dominance of relativist tendencies, working for a Europe of internal solidarity and of solidarity with the poorest nations, witnessing to the basic values which a Christian vision can foster, and supporting European initiatives for peace in our continent and further afield. Our public servants and our elected representatives should be encouraged and sustained to bring to the European project values which have consolidated the best of our experience. Protocols on their own cannot guarantee that what is desired will be achieved. It would be naive to think otherwise. But without such protocols, the task of defending the values in question would be much less secure. Europe needs to examine its values. It needs to examine its economic values. I'd like here, something I do rarely, to quote myself, to quote something that I said addressing the Forum on Europe just over 2 years ago. I said, "Certainly, I would not like the European Union to be reduced just to a purely economic organisation. But it is important that its economy be based on sound economic values. What is at stake here are the livelihood and prosperity of European citizens, especially its weakest ones. Such economic values include fair competition practices, good corporate governance, sound fiscal policies, the rejection of corruption, the avoidance of the exploitation of national interest or narrow particular interests to the detriment of the common good." End quote. I do not claim to be a prophet, but we can see today how sound economic policy and transparent systems of regulation are really essential. And once again, it's useful to remind ourselves, as I said about the abortion debate, that there are very few who would say that the malpractice which is at the root of much of our current economic system was Brussels-driven rather than homegrown. In many ways, Brussels is not the problem, but it is recognized more and more as an essential part of the solution. Sound economic policy is essential. Today, however, we're in doubt as to what sound economic policy might be. As one who trades in infallibility, I'm happy to see the weakness of one group of my erstwhile competitors, those who spoke in almost dogmatic tones of their economic theory. Economic activity is only one dimension of human activity, and it can never be sustained in an ethical and legal vacuum. There are human needs which cannot be attended to just by the market, and indeed there are values and needs which should not be bought and sold just like commodities. The nature of a modern economy has indeed changed, and in a knowledge-based economy, people are the central driving force. If this is so, then economic values which are important today must include the enhancement of people, their inclusion, and their participation. There's a striking short sentence in an encyclical of Pope John Paul about Europe. He says, "Saying Europe must be equivalent to saying openness." He went on to say, Europe cannot close in on itself. It cannot and must not lose interest in the rest of the world. On the contrary, it must remain fully aware of the fact that other countries, other continents, await its bold initiatives in order to offer to poorer peoples the means for their growth and social organization, and to build a more just and fraternal world. There is a sense in which a Europe based on the concept of integration can never be satisfied to work just within its own boundaries. Its sense of responsibility must always be outward looking. And this doesn't mean that it should embrace every country as a member, and that its borders should be open indiscriminately to all. European expansion is complex. But studies have shown that those countries of Central and Eastern Europe which have been most successful in their search to become modern democratic nations with a flourishing free market are those who had to go through the process, the exercise, of adapting to the norms of European integration. The process in itself has a value. There's no shortcut along the path to economic and democratic reforms needed to join the European Union. Pope John Paul II, who I've quoted, was an extraordinary European. I always remember the first time I heard him explicitly state his view that the decisions of Yalta were unjust and had to be overturned. At that time, that was heresy. Political, as politically incorrect as you could get at the time. Yalta, no matter how undesirable, was a factum realpolitik, and to challenge it, according to the accepted wisdom, was to put the stability of Europe at risk. And even the Helsinki process, which played an enormous role in fostering the promotion and protection of human rights across Europe, set out from the presumption that there should be no changes in European boundaries. In the context of the time, that almost implicitly meant that the regimes of Eastern Europe, and in particular the German Democratic Republic, would remain for much time to come. It's amusing to see the list of those who signed the Helsinki agreements. The signatures of all the party chiefs and dictators of Eastern Europe are there. I won't comment on the names of the Western side, as maybe one of them is present here with us. But you know, we have moved from an extraordinarily divided Europe to something which is much greater. What is the way forward? A recent newspaper report announced that the Irish bishops had decided to encourage a yes vote in a second referendum. That was news to me. The bishops have not discussed the matter, and there's no way in which I could envisage making any comment without knowing first something about the nature and the precise text of the protocols that will be agreed on. We'll have to wait and see. I'm not sure that it's my task as a bishop to tell people how to vote. I make no apology for being personally enthusiastic about much which has come about through European integration. And I know it would be foolish of me to attempt to foresee how in the future protocols might be interpreted in an era in which European, but also Irish culture is changing. My task as a bishop is to challenge those who belong to the Christian community, to address the issues on the basis of their faith, and to be involved in critical judgment and participation in debate, and of course, through voting. Pope Benedict has stressed that the just ordering of society and the state is a central responsibility of politics, and the Church cannot and must not take upon herself the political battle to bring about the most just society possible. She cannot and must not replace the state. So it's clear that parties and individuals may legitimately support the treaty, and others may legitimately oppose it. What seemed to me strange at the last referendum was that parties who supported the treaty found it difficult to say that together, and seemed to want to make party political gains around the issue. The electorate on its part needs to have at its disposal knowledge that is sufficiently clear for them to make a decision on how to vote. The pastoral message of the bishops in the last referendum condemned unreservedly those who would seek to influence the outcome of the referendum, whether by offering misleading or even patently incorrect advice, or by introducing extraneous factors into the debate. That statement is as valid as it was then. There are many who wanted the Catholic bishops to have spoken out in favour of a yes or a no vote in the last referendum. I believe that the bishop's message provided a comprehensive reflection on the issues involved, but also about how Christians should be present in the European project. European Christians need to have, as I said, a Europe strategy. A Europe strategy appropriate to a pluralist, democratic political system. That means that such a strategy should sustain what is good in any aspect of European policy and challenge what is lacking in it or even wrong in it. But to be credible as such, the Christian must have the courage to do both, to sustain and criticize, and not to be content to take occasional pot shots from the sideline. The Europe of the future needs to be a Europe of participation. This means that we enhance the structures for participation. There's a lot of dissatisfaction there. But it also means that we, as Christians, but all of us as Europeans, whatever our beliefs, must be willing to participate, to take part actively and critically in that future. I thank you.